members of Congress, governors, Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, and those joining us today in this chamber, we gather here as mandated by the national constitution to report on the state of our nation to the entire Argentine people watching us from every corner of the country. Since taking on the challenge of leading the nation at what is arguably the most critical economic moment in its history. Following more than 100 years under an impoverishing model and having almost completely forgotten the ideas that once made our country great, the last 20 years have been especially disastrous economically, the worst Argentina has ever faced. Indeed, the economic data from the legacy we inherited have been public since day one of our administration. Credit and transport have been suppressed in some cases to a fifth of their real value, and the dollar shows a 200% gap between the official and parallel rates. During the first 3 years of government, in the first week of December, retail inflation was running at an annual pace, accelerating to 7,500% annually in the second week, while for those who consider these numbers a fantasy, monthly wholesale inflation was 52%, implying an annual inflation of liabilities, making investment difficult, reducing the capital stock per inhabitant. The brutality of the legacy we received and the havoc it has wreaked. The famous model of a state of beneficiaries without contributions through moratoriums have met their responsibilities, the retirees, and if it were not for the discretionary recomposition of bonds we are undertaking, would have resulted in a loss of up to 40% of their purchasing power. In fact, the recurrent use of compensatory bonds is a clear indication of how poorly designed the formula is and requires urgent modification so that retirees are not victims of political mishaps. In terms of security, we find ourselves with a society abandoned to its fate. Entire cities under the grip of drug trafficking, streets taken over by chaos and disorder, both generated by organizations constantly challenging different governments, a chaos that politics has fueled for the last 20 years for its own benefit. In the face of this, security forces mistreated and trampled by previous governments during the pandemic. Regarding education, a crisis in which what is needed is more capitalism and more freedom. Due to the commercial and irresponsible policy of the previous government that left doctors, patients, and special families, such as oncology patients, in the midst of the farce of the state taking care of you during the pandemic, where if we had acted as a mediocre country, we would have had 30,000 real deaths, while we had 130,000. This is what they sold us, the idea that the state works like insurance, but in real life, when the disaster occurs, it turns its back. Technically speaking, this happens when they steal the premium, as can be inferred from a state that does everything very poorly. In defense, we inherited an army underfunded by the state itself. Without the resources or preparation to face the challenges of a constantly changing world and increasingly distant from peace, making us incapable of protecting our own territory and forcing us to bow before the world's most questioned countries. This is the reality left to us. A country that, by right and history, is one of the most, a country that 120 years ago was self-reliant in every aspect of social life, but when one spends their own money on themselves, it controls poorly, not designed to fulfill its basic functions, but to create a kiosk at every possible location for its own benefit. Recently, the media are the best example of this, a system designed to create an intermediary between different state agencies in order to charge returns on each operation, a corrupt system that has generated hundreds of millions of dollars in returns that ended up in the pockets of politicians. The definition we can give of the situation in which we found the state is a criminal organization designed so that in every permit, every regulation, every procedure, and every operation, both the executive, legislative, and judicial powers at all levels national, provincial, and municipal, supported by the media, i.e., a system in absolute moral and intrinsic bankruptcy. A system that can only generate poverty and at their expense produces a privileged caste living as if they were monarchs, reaching obscene levels of impunity in a private chat. Living proof that a system that does so much harm to so many people is no accident. The disaster we have been plunged into is a conscious and planned scheme. What I call the caste model, among the privileges of politics and the discomfort of ordinary Argentines to expropriate wealth from Argentines to their clients and friends, at the root of the generalized deterioration of the last 100 years, the construction of a facade, a business sheltered in lies. This is the regrettable material and spiritual state of our nation for many years. We have denounced this model to the silent society of those who produce, the unprotected Argentine rural workers capable of enduring economic contexts similar to those I face today. During the election campaign, we spoke to the Argentine people with the truth for the first time in decades, and the people understood, accepted, and elected us, even though there were other candidates who promised the same old solutions, repeating the same conciliatory and deceptive speech as always. For the first time in a long time, society chose the candidate who preferred to tell an uncomfortable truth rather than a comfortable lie. We proposed to society that the only way to avoid an even worse economic catastrophe would be with a brutal and rapid adjustment of public spending, a lagged society product of monetary issuance, generating months of worldwide inflation, additional reserves covering more than 90% of it. Not only that, the monetary base, which during the 21st century was around 9% of GDP, today represents only 3%, while considering that in the last month the price of the parallel dollar has plummeted. The gap with the import dollar corrected by the country tax has disappeared. The dollar rates have aligned with the guidelines set by the BCRA in a context in which the price rises. The country risk of high inflation will continue to fall sharply, and the exit from the exchange controls will be ever closer. Fourth, we have been able to solve the problem of the debt of importers, which was a sword hanging over the head of all Argentines. As a result of all these economic measures, we have reached both primary and financial surplus in our first month of government, which constitutes a global record in the history of modern capitalism. And as if that were not enough, we have taken all these measures solely with the mechanisms of the executive power, without support of any kind from the rest of the political spectrum. Our approach is not limited only to the economic. In security, we have inaugurated a new doctrine of public order that no one dared to implement, although it was the only correct path. Firstly, we began to enforce the law without exceptions, which is why we freed the streets from the scourge of constant strikes through our public order protocol in each and every one of the demonstrations that were called in these almost 3 months of government, which began immediately as soon as we took office, breaking a record in democratic history. In all of them, we maintained order and avoided indiscriminate cuts by the forces. Additionally, we are restructuring police organizations in Rosario, and thanks to prevention work, we have managed to reduce crime by almost 60% in these 2 months. We created a special management system for high-risk prisoners in our penitentiary system, a practice that unfortunately became common in recent times. Regarding social assistance, it helped us uncover the perverse mechanism that piquetero organizations use to bring people against their will to social demonstrations. We are ending the extortion of social organizations towards beneficiaries, and thanks to the security protocol implemented by Minister Patricia Bullrich, we are also ending the daily extortion that social organizations impose on society every time they block a street. We always said in our government, those who block, do not get paid, but we have the will to protect as much as possible the victims of the impoverishing system we are trying to change. No Argentine is to blame for the incompetence and greed of politicians having destroyed their incomes, especially the most vulnerable. Therefore, we decided to end the intermediary system of assistance and strengthen direct assistance mechanisms. In this line, we have doubled the amounts of the Universal Child Allowance, Pregnancy Allowance, and the food card so that families affected by dramatic increases in this new school year can buy school supplies and materials. That's why we included in the decree of necessity and urgency, education as an essential service, alongside unions, and will force them to provide at least 70% of the educational service during any strike. We always said that we asked for the vote not to give us power, but to return it to the Argentines. This crusade begins by reducing the size of the state to its minimum indispensable and purging it of privileges for politicians and their friends. For this reason, we reduced from 18 to 8 ministries, eliminating public positions. We got rid of government agencies like INADI, which, besides playing the role of thought police, had an annual budget of 2,800 million pesos that historically were used as currency to buy political support. That's why the National Civil Aviation Administration will establish a new regulatory criterion so that no politician or their relatives can use private planes except for strictly official matters. Also, from the 1st of March, no official traveling with a ticket paid by a public body can accumulate miles for personal trips. All ministries have complied with the mandate to decommission at least 30% of their fleet. We also eliminated import permits, putting an end to the era of bribes in exchange for import permits. Lastly, we also signed a mega decree of necessity and urgency to, for the first time in 3 decades, return freedom to the Argentines instead of restricting it. This decree included 366 articles that eliminate or modify regulations that hindered the economy, complicated people's lives to protect some privilege or aggravated the problems they were supposed to solve. Among these things, I want to highlight that we freed the choice of health insurance so that workers are no longer prisoners of the union of their activity and can choose whichever service provider they prefer. We repealed the nefarious rental law. As a result, the offer in the market doubled from December to February. Consequently, the real value of rents decreased. We also repealed the nefarious supply law, which was a tool politicians used to extort companies, and we prohibited the power of politics to ban exports. We modernized labor legislation to facilitate the hiring of registered employment, something that was fought by unions. However, all these early achievements represent only the surface of the great changes we have come to implement in Argentina. To deepen our mission to end the privileges of politics and its friends, we are sending Congress an anti-caste package of laws. I want to share with you some of its components. We will eliminate privileged pensions for presidents and vice presidents. We will require unions to elect their authorities through periodic, free elections supervised by the electoral authority. Those who impose labor conditions on people will not be able to run as candidates in national elections. Moreover, any public official convicted of corruption will automatically lose any benefit they had for being an official. We will drastically reduce the number of contracts for advisors of deputies and senators of the nation. It has been a common practice of politics that representatives of the people, the Argentine people, will have their salary deducted for the day they do not go to work due to a strike. And at the same time, we will eliminate public financing of political parties. Each party will have to finance itself with voluntary contributions from the world, except for some lapdogs of Argentine politics. It coincides that financing the treasury with money issued by the central bank of all Argentines personally. However, In Argentina we have done it time and again. And as a result, we are one of the countries with the highest inflation in modern history. With this it ends. We will send a project to Congress to penalize by law the President of the nation, the Minister of Economy, officials of the central bank, and deputies and senators, and also propose that such a crime be considered a crime against humanity so that sooner or later they pay the cost of their actions. These are just some of the reforms we will implement. We will advance either through bills, decrees, or modifying regulations in the most ambitious economic regulation process in our history, because if we do not change this economic model from the root, Argentina has no future. However, all these measures we have implemented, as well as the reform projects we have promoted, have been received with suspicion and distrust by a large part of the Argentine political leadership. Argentines who reflected some of the changes we want to advance show this. A law that aims to embrace the model of freedom, inspired by the ideas of Alberti and the generation of 37, which comes to liberate the productive forces of the Argentines, to return freedoms, to end privileges and businesses of the caste, was manipulated and rejected by a part of the political class that resists change. Because we must not deceive ourselves, there is an important sector, Cristina Fernandez. The path also does not escape us because we know from the day we decided to get into politics that this fight was not going to be easy. I want to tell you, however, that if you choose the path of confrontation, you will find a very different animal than you are used to. Because unlike some of those here or those watching us from their province, politics for us is not an end in itself. We do not live for politics. We do not live off politics. We have no ambition for power. Far from all that. The only thing we have is decisions thinking about our political career. We came to raise the flags of freedom with full awareness that we were going to have to pay the costs of the obscene party that many of you held. Because what moves us is not power for the sake of power, but our sacred cause, the defense of life, liberty, and private property of Argentines. We do not seek nor provoke confrontation. We do not want to discuss the past. We come to propose a future agenda. Because as the saying goes, the secret of change is to focus all your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. We come to put our energy into building the new. But I want to tell all those here and those watching us that if what you are looking for is conflict, you will have conflict. Because unlike some of you who are thinking about your next election or your own interests, we only think about defending the cause of freedom, rebuilding our nation, and providing a future of prosperity for our children at any cost. However, confrontation is not the path we want nor the one we choose. There is another possible path, a different path, a path of peace and not confrontation, a path of agreement and not conflict against change. I must be honest in telling you that I do not have too much hope that you will take this path. I believe that corruption, meanness, and selfishness are too widespread. But while I do not have too much hope, I have not lost it either. In fact, I want you to prove me wrong. I challenge you to prove that politics can be more than what it is. That we can aspire to be better. That despite our differences, we can put the interests of the nation ahead of miserable electoral interests. For this reason, and with the desire to be wrong in my distrust of many of you, I want to take this opportunity to extend an invitation to you today. At the first opening of sessions of our administration, I want to call both governors and former presidents and leaders of the main political parties to put our personal interests aside and meet next May 25th in the province of Córdoba for the signing of a new social contract called the MELEI Pact. A social contract that establishes the 10 principles of the new Argentine economic order. In this way, I hope we can leave behind the antinomies of the past, abandon the recipes for failure, and embrace, as our founding fathers did more than 200 years ago, the ideas of freedom once and for all. This May Pact will aim to establish the 10 state policies that the country needs to leave the path of failure and begin to walk the path of prosperity. Private property. 2. Fiscal balance. 3. Reduction of public spending to historical levels around 25%. 4. A tax reform that reduces tax pressure, simplifies the lives of Argentines, and promotes trade. 5. A federal participation of taxes and end forever the current extortive model. 6. A commitment from the provinces to advance in the exploitation of the country's natural resources. 7. A modern labor reform that promotes formal work. 8. A pension reform. 9. A structural political reform that modifies the current system and realigns the interests of representatives and the represented. These 10 ideas, which are the basis of progress for any nation, can lay the groundwork for Argentine growth for the next 100 years so that once again Argentina can be a beacon of light for the West. All politics is invited to join us. It does not matter who you are, where you come from, and what ideas you have defended. To show the government's commitment to move in this direction, I have instructed the Chief of Staff, the Minister of Economy, and the Minister of the Interior to convene the governors of all Argentine provinces to the Casa Rosada to sign a preliminary agreement and enact both the base law and a package of tax relief for the provinces. Both laws enacted as a show of goodwill. We can start working on a common document based on these 10 previously outlined principles, so that on May 25th of this year, gathered in Córdoba, we can start a new era of glory for our country. This is the offer we put on the table. It is up to you and the rest of the Argentine leadership to take advantage of the opportunity to change history or, on the contrary, pretend to continue on this path of decline that they have brought us to. That day we will see who is seated on this path of servitude. An agricultural, energy, commercial, maritime, and technological productive power, full of life to populate the corners of the homeland with the spirit of the frontier that once characterized us. That is the country we govern for. To conclude this message to the governors, the leaders, the different parties of the political system, to the deputies and senators present here today, I tell you, a pivotal moment in Argentine history. You can cling to an unfair system of which the vast majority of society is a victim. Or you can put aside your particular interests and ideological prejudices. May God bless the Argentines and may the force of heaven accompany us. Thank you very much, National Congress. We have listened to the traditional message to the entire country before the Honorable Legislative Assembly from the Chamber of the Honorable Chamber of Deputies of Mr. President of the Nation, Dr.
Segundo, evitamos el default con el FMI y otros organismos multilaterales en el que íbamos a caer a 11 días de haber asumido. Tercero, cortamos con la emisión monetaria